The English Channel had not frozen since the Napoleonic Wars, and then, in 1947, it did. It was 6:45 in the morning on February the 20th, 1947, and Captain Arthur Meredith stood on the bridge of the SS Maid of Orleans at Dover's eastern docks staring at something that had no right to exist. Pack ice in the Channel. Grinding slowly eastward on a grey flood tide, plate upon plate of it, 6 inches thick in places, stretching from the Belgian coast far enough offshore that the shipping lanes were gone. Dissolved. Replaced by something that looked more like the Baltic than the most travelled stretch of water in the world. Standard procedure said you kept to the schedule. The boat train had arrived from Victoria at 6:22. All 117 passengers stood on the platform behind the customs shed with trunks, valises and tickets stamped Ostend. Meredith looked at the ice. Then he picked up the telephone and called the harbour master. The answer was no. For the first time in the 20th century, the cross-channel ferry service between Dover and Ostend was suspended due to pack ice. Not fog, not a storm. Ice. To understand what this meant, you have to understand what the winter of 47 had already done to Britain. It had begun quietly. December of 1946 had been unremarkable, cold in the usual British way, grey, damp, uninspiring. Then January arrived and tightened its grip. Temperatures across England fell and stayed fallen. Snow came not in one dramatic blizzard but in repeated waves, each fall compressing the last until the country lay under a continuous white sheet that showed no intention of retreating. Coal stocks, already depleted by the demands of a country rebuilding from 6 years of war, began to run short. Power stations cut output. Factories closed. By early February, the Board of Trade had ordered electricity cuts across domestic and industrial users alike. People sat in cold flats in the dark, listening to the BBC on battery radios, waiting for something to break. Nothing broke. It deepened. At Kew Observatory, southwest of London, the meteorological records for February 1947 would later become one of the most cited documents in British climatological history. The mean temperature for the month was minus 1.6 degrees Celsius, and at no point during the entire 28 days did the thermometer rise above 5 degrees. Only 2 nights recorded temperatures above freezing, and only barely. These were not figures drawn from Scotland or the Yorkshire moors. This was London. The Thames froze in the upper reaches. Ice formed in the pools of Hampstead Heath. Children skated on village ponds across the home counties in conditions that had not existed within living memory. And all of that cold had been doing something in the southern North Sea and the Eastern Channel that nobody had seen in a generation. Water temperature at the surface off the Belgian coast had been dropping steadily since late January. By the second week of February, temperatures in the shallow coastal waters east of Dunkirk were approaching 0. And when a long fetch of northeasterly wind came driving down from the direction of Denmark across those already near-freezing shallows, the result was ice formation on a scale that the channel pilots and harbour masters found genuinely alarming. Pack ice, not the thin skimming frost of a hard night, but solid interlocking plates capable of immobilising a vessel, of bending steel, of killing propellers. By the 17th of February, the port authorities at Ostend had begun reporting ice floes in the outer approaches. By the 19th, a Belgian tug sent to investigate returned with bent propeller blades and a cautious report from her skipper. On the morning of the 20th, the decision was made simultaneously at both ends of the route. Dover closed, Ostend closed. The service stopped. It did not seem, from the outside, like a major catastrophe. Compared to what was happening elsewhere, trains buried in Cumbrian snowdrifts, villages in Wales without food deliveries for a fortnight, coal wagons frozen solid on sidings across Yorkshire. A suspended ferry service felt manageable, inconvenient. People would wait. But the boat train connection between London and the continent was not simply a convenience for holiday travellers. In the winter of 47, it was one of the primary channels through which diplomatic mail moved, through which relief goods from continental Europe reached British ports, through which the mechanics of a recovering post-war Europe continued to function, and it had stopped. At Victoria Station in London, the continental departure boards began displaying the word that railway staff had learned to dread that winter: suspended. The 9:45 to Dover Marine, the boat train connection for Ostend, suspended. The Folkestone Harbour service for Boulogne had already been reduced to a skeleton operation, plagued by ice conditions in the harbour approaches and struggling to maintain any schedule against the persistent northeasterly. Now that line felt the pressure too. Albert Robson, a Southern Railway operating supervisor at Victoria, recorded in his duty log on the 20th of February that 6 separate boat train services were cancelled or indefinitely postponed before noon. The platform announcement system had broken down twice in the cold. The mechanism that drove the letters on the departure board had seized, and staff were posting handwritten notices on the indicator frames with freezing fingers. Meanwhile, at sea, the picture was worsening. The ice in the channel was not static. Pack ice moves. It follows tides, wind direction, the slow pressure differentials of open water systems. The floes that had formed off the Belgian coast were drifting westward on the prevailing current, and by the 21st of February they had spread far enough that isolated patches were being reported off the Kent coast itself. Fishermen working out of Folkestone and Ramsgate came back early. A lightship tender operating near the South Goodwin reported navigating through scattered ice at a position that put it clearly within English territorial waters. Ice in the channel, miles from shore. The meteorological office at Dunstable, which had been publishing daily forecasts of grinding grimness since early January, now found itself facing a genuine historical anomaly. Senior forecaster Leonard Hawkes noted in his working papers, later archived with the Meteorological Office records, that the sea surface temperature anomaly in the southern North Sea and Eastern Channel during February 1947 was the most significant he had observed in 22 years of service. The conditions were not unlike those reported in certain Baltic and North Sea sectors during the severe European winter of 1940–41. The comparison was not reassuring. Back at Dover, Captain Meredith was spending his enforced idleness in a way that most people in Britain were spending that winter, in a small office with an inadequate coal fire, reviewing paperwork and waiting. The Maid of Orleans, the Canterbury and the Invicta, the core of the Dover-Austin fleet, sat at their berths going nowhere. The crews drew their pay, kept the boilers at reduced pressure and watched the ice. Not everyone was still. The railway operating departments on both sides of the channel were attempting to find workarounds. Southern Railway dispatched a survey team to examine whether the Folkestone-Boulogne route could be kept open, even on a reduced basis, using the Packet steamer autocarrier, which had a slightly more robust hull configuration. The answer came back negative. The Boulogne approaches were not as badly iced as Ostend, but the harbour entrance itself had sufficient ice debris to make berthing extremely hazardous. The pilot at Boulogne, a man named Gustave Vander, sent a tersely worded assessment to his counterparts in Folkestone, navigable in emergency only, not scheduled service. The mail problem was acute. The General Post Office had contingency arrangements for channel disruption. They always had, storm closures were common in winter, but those arrangements assumed closures measured in hours, perhaps a day. The ice suspension ran on. By the 22nd, post intended for Belgium, the Netherlands and Germany, was accumulating in sealed bags in the postal vans at Dover Marine Station. Continental newspapers due in London were missing from the stands. Businessmen waiting for correspondence from Brussels and Amsterdam rang their banks and found the clerks equally uninformed. The irony was bitter. Britain in February 1947 was rationed, cold, power cut, and exhausted. And now even the mail had stopped. The suspension lasted 9 days. On the 1st of March, a shift in the pressure pattern over northern Europe began to push warmer Atlantic air eastward across the British Isles for the first time in weeks. Not warm by any ordinary standard, temperatures were still below the seasonal average, but significantly less cold. The persistent northeasterly that had been feeding the ice formation weakened and backed southwest. The ice in the channel's eastern approaches, denied the conditions that had sustained it, began slowly to break up. At Ostend on the 2nd of March, harbour officials reported that the outer approaches were showing signs of clearing. By the morning of the 3rd, a trial run was ordered. The Belgian packet Prince Baudouin left Ostend under cautious instructions at 6 in the morning of March the 3rd. Her master, Captain Emile Claes, took the vessel out slowly, and following the cleared lane that had been marked by a harbour tug sent ahead the previous evening. There was still ice, not the solid pack of February, but a considerable quantity of loose floe debris, some pieces large enough to cause concern. Claes kept his speed low, kept his crew on the bow watching, and made the crossing in 3 hours and 40 minutes, roughly an hour longer than the standard crossing time. The boat trains resumed on March the 4th. The passengers who had been waiting, some of them since the 20th of February, moved through the customs shed at Dover Marine, down the gangway, and onto the ferry in a procession that had something almost ritual about it. Normality reinstated. The departure board at Victoria clicked back into its usual rhythm. Albert Robson, the Southern Railway supervisor, who had been posting handwritten cancellation notices a fortnight earlier, noted in his log simply, "Continental services restored. Full operation. No elaboration." Railway operating staff were not given to sentiment, but the 9 days in February had exposed something that the winter of 1947 was making plain at every point where infrastructure met extreme cold. The margin between function and failure was far narrower than the systems had been designed to acknowledge. The boat train network, the ferry services, the mail connections, they had been built for the Channel's usual winter temperament. Rough, certainly, occasionally brutal, but not this, not ice. At Kew, the record books for February 1947 sat on the shelf through the following decades, consulted occasionally by researchers, cited in climatological papers. The figures were stark and did not require interpretation. Coldest February of the century, lowest mean temperature for any month in the modern record. And in the shipping lane that had connected England to the continent, almost without interruption through 2 world wars, for 9 days in the deepest cold nothing moved. The Channel had stopped, it has not stopped since.